Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. The Book of Dark Names by Katie Rogers, read by Katie Rogers. Chapter 19. The shoreline had all but disappeared as the boat took the small band of allies further out to sea. Christopher had managed to secure them a vessel equipped with all that was necessary for what lay ahead. The truth was, not much of it would be needed, at least for the first part of their journey. Daniel's newfound abilities would carry them through that. They were in search of an island located in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. It was called Palais, and it had been home to Kaddoth and his fellow Darklings eons ago during their hellish reign. Rashad's books talked about the island being swallowed up shortly after the banishing. Most of his readers interpreted that to mean that it had sank into the ocean's depths. Daniel, however, told a different story. The island city had been swallowed up all right, but not by the sea. It was the victim of a dimensional shift. This incidentally explained all the missing people, planes, and boats over the years. The phenomenon acted as a gateway which opened up into other realms and sucked anything within range through the door. As Christopher piloted the boat to the coordinates given to him by Daniel, he wondered if he and the others were about to join the ranks of the missing. He quickly pushed the thought from his mind because he knew they had to risk it. A key player to the end game was imprisoned inside a tomb on Palais. His name was Anephasis. In the days of the Dark One's reign, he gave them his children to use as they pleased in exchange for immortality and power. It was he who established their savage religion and all of its barbaric rituals and practices. Many of these same practices carried on within the ancient religions where child sacrifice to appease a god was done. In both Howard and Rashad's books, he is referred to as the high priest of the elder gods. When the great old ones defeated and banished all the others, they punished Anephasis along with them. He was entombed for all eternity on Palais, held fast by the sacred symbols on the door. Should these symbols be removed, he would be free again, and it was imperative that not happen. He was the one who could perform the ritual to resurrect Kaddoth's sister, Khafra, thus enabling him to free the others. This was Kaddoth's intention all along. He had given Anna his sister's power only to hold on to until he could get back to Palais. Anephasis would return Anna to the grave and bring Khafra back. As Christopher tried to keep his mind from racing, the sound of someone climbing up the steps behind him drew him out of his internal chaos. Yesterday, upon a stair, I met a man who wasn't there. Daniel's twisted attempt at humor did nothing to lighten Christopher's mood. For Palais itself was not there, or at least not in their realm. They were heading for a destination that did not exist on any world map. Not in this world. Is there a meaning to that? Christopher asked, keeping his eyes forward. Only that the fellow on the staircase and our island have something in common, Daniel answered. And that is, the scientist shrugged. They both have that same eerie feeling of uncertainty, Daniel replied. Christopher laughed in response as he shook his head. There couldn't be a truer observation about all the sentiment shared among the crew. To say that they were on edge would have been an understatement. "I think we will lose the light before we get there," Daniel said ominously, drawing Chris back into the conversation. "Yes, you're probably right," Christopher nodded. He stood quietly for a moment, weighing whether or not he should broach the topic of concern on his mind. Ultimately, he decided he would. "There is one thing that does have me more worried right now," he confessed. "What's that?" Daniel asked in a tone that suggested he already knew. "You just acquired all this knowledge and ability, Dan. How confident are you about guiding us all through to another realm?" Christopher asked anxiously. Even though he had seen things that defied all manner of laws, he still was having a hard time letting go of everything he knew to be true. Ordinarily, Daniel would have been irritated at his stubbornness, but not this time. "When we get there, the dimensional shift will do most of the work. We just need to get caught in its pull. We'll be like light in the grip of a black hole," he explained. Christopher gave his companion a look that suggested he was not soothed in any way by what he had just said. "Look, Harris, none of this is ideal. But like anything else, it's all going to come down to us and our willingness to fight. We have a chance, and we've got to take it. If we remember that, then we have hope of finding our way back out of the dark." This did have a calming effect on him. He gave Daniel a grateful smile before moving on to another subject. "So is the gateway in our realm yet?" Christopher asked. "Not quite," Daniel told him. "When will it be?" "If we reach the coordinates by nightfall, we will see it happen," Daniel replied. "So it's going to happen by nightfall," Christopher surmised. "Yeah, pretty much," Daniel confirmed. The two men once again fell into a semi-comfortable silence before Daniel decided to voice a nagging concern of his own. "I want you to know that out of all of us, Christopher, I understood how you loved Evelyn." Daniel watched as the scientist's body stiffened a little, then returned to a slightly less relaxed stance. "Why are you bringing this up now?" he asked without looking back. "I suppose it's because out of all of us who are involved in this nightmare, you have sacrificed the most. You suffered the loss of your family and the woman you loved. That day at Evelyn's funeral when you lost your shit at the minister, I got it. I totally got it," Daniel said. "I imagine you did," Christopher replied. "After all, you did lose Anna. Maybe not to death, but it was equally terrible." "Yes, it was," Daniel admitted. "But I have to confess, there is another reason I bring this up." "Okay, what is it?" Chris shrugged. "This thing we're about to do. It's going to require a greater sacrifice from one of us that is inconceivable," Daniel told him. "How so?" Christopher asked, intrigued. "It will come down to a choice, one that will determine everything. When that happens, just know, I believe in you." This time Christopher spun around to face him. Daniel stood quietly, his eyes as steady as the waves beneath them. He could see the millions of questions filling the scientist's mind. How had he known about that phrase, about its significance? Evelyn would say it to him before every debate or big event in his college career. Even after they were no longer together, he would hear her voice in his head, propping him up. A swell of sympathy began to rise within Daniel as he watched the inner turmoil of his compatriot unfold. He probably should not have said anything at all. To do so was to risk things going in the wrong direction. But he was human, after all. He simply could not help himself. He wanted to give Christopher a slight heads up of the difficult choice that would be laid at his feet. "I'm sorry," he apologized. "I did not mean for this to cause you so much tension. I just wanted you to know from one man in love to another. I understand." Daniel then turned on his heel and went below deck. He couldn't say any more, and Christopher, being who he was, wouldn't be content to leave it alone. The scientist, who was more than a little bewildered by their exchange, did his best to refocus on the immediate goal. As predicted, they reached their destination just after sunset. Everyone had come up on deck and was waiting on bated breath to witness the phenomenon that only the missing could attest to. Daniel resumed his place behind Christopher. He was going to act as a compass and guide them into the Gateway's pool. Daniel then told him to turn off the engines and let them drift. The sound of the waves slapping against the boat was intensified by the eerie silence. As they drifted aimlessly over the water, Christopher, along with everyone else, was becoming agitated. This whole situation right now was unsettling, to say the least. They were a boat full of control freaks having to let go and wait. As their collective feeling of unease reached an almost fevered pitch, the extraordinary made an appearance. The moon, that had subtly begun to rise over the sea, started changing from a beautiful gold to a deep crimson. The water beneath, which was already dark, became black as pitch. In the distance they saw a wall of ghostly fog charging towards them like an infantry from beyond. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the advancing mist, headed right in their direction. "Dan," Christopher asked, feeling the need to act. "Do nothing," Daniel replied calmly. "But sit tight," he ordered abruptly, cutting off any arguments. As the fog overtook them, Christopher watched in dismay as Sean, Richard, and Laura disappeared into the thick haze. The gray mist grew so dense that he could scarcely see Daniel standing beside him. The stars became non-existent, and the moon was now a faint red glimmer. The eerie silence that had plagued them since he cut the engines was now a deafening whisper of impending dread. As they continued to drift without direction, Christopher felt a sense of panic take hold. He didn't like this. He hated it, in fact. Just as he was about to lose his senses, he felt Daniel's hand grip his shoulder firmly in that manner that Evelyn used to. "Steady your mind, Christopher," he murmured, just as she would when he got nervous before a debate. It was strange how one little gesture such as this could make a difference. But when he heard those words and felt that familiar pressure on his shoulder, he managed to refocus. "Sean, Richard, Laura, are you guys okay?" Daniel called, sensing their growing anxiety. "As well as can be expected," Richard replied. "I know it's going to be difficult, but we have to remember to try and control any negative emotion. Let's not forget, these things feed on them," Daniel reminded everyone. "We know, Danny, but they're not making it easy," Laura answered earnestly. "Look over there, the moon!" Sean exclaimed. Everybody directed their attention to the red satellite, which was now emerging from the mist. The fog was thinning out around the crimson orb, letting its ruby light shine through. They all continued to watch, spellbound, when the mist lifted like an eyelid, opening up to reveal the glaring iris beneath. The silence that had brought them so much unease was broken by a noise more frightening than the loudest thunder. A deep boom resonated from the sky, which was followed by a strange wind that resembled unearthly breathing. With each inhale, the fog thinned, but it did nothing to calm their nerves. Their blood ran hot and cold with fear. Then something even more astounding happened. The eye, which had taken on a more inhuman appearance, blinked. It focused down on the water below, casting its garnet beams upon the waves. They penetrated the black tide down into their murky depths, awakening something deep below. The distinct sound of heavy locks upon a massive gate being slid out of place carried up from the bottom of the sea. As Daniel listened to it, he knew things were about to get rough. He looked down at his friends still standing, frozen in place on the deck. They were sitting ducks. "You three, get below, go now," he ordered. "Danny?" A loud thud against the boat interrupted Laura's question, followed by another, then another. "What's going on? What is that?" Richard asked in a shaky voice. "The sea life. They sense the drift, and they're trying to get away. Now get below deck, all of you. The gate is about to open, and we are in for a rough ride." The urgency in Daniel's voice was enough to make them move quickly to safety. The intermittent thuds became a constant pounding as the creatures of the deep tried to flee. To be honest, Christopher and everyone on board had to fight their instincts not to do the same, but unlike the animals, they had no choice. They had to cross the divide. Christopher looked up again at the eye, and this time its beams were bright like fire and growing in width. The more they expanded, the more nervous the sea creatures became. The surface of the black water was teeming with all sorts of marine life, with a common goal: getting the hell out of there. They knew something wicked was on its way, and they wanted no part of it. The pelting of various creatures was becoming so vigorous now that the boat was being knocked about. "Turn the engines on, Chris, and head for those beams," Daniel commanded. "I don't know if we can with all these animals around. One could get caught in the propeller and tear it up," Christopher warned. "Do it! Do it now!" Daniel yelled. Going against his better judgment, he did what he was told. To his relief, nothing got caught, but as they moved through the chaos, he felt and heard the propellers grinding things to bits. He had to fight like the devil to keep the boat on course, but he managed. Luckily, they did not have far to go to reach the beams. When the front of the yacht reached the red glow, he felt an odd sense of ease. It was very short-lived, however, due to a whale breaching the surface and knocking into them. The large mammal sent them into a tailspin and nearly made them capsize. In all the pandemonium, the last lock on the gate slid off, turning the horizon and water beneath it to a fiery red. In the blink of the crimson eye above, the Harris family yacht jumped dimensions. The chaos that had surrounded them was gone, and the silence had returned. There was still a slight mist, but nothing like they had experienced before. The only relief that Christopher was able to find in their new situation was the lack of frightened sea life. Sean, Laura, and Richard emerged once again from below deck when all fell quiet. They were glad to see that Daniel and Christopher were okay. Uncertainty hung in the air like the fog around them. The strange new world shared many similarities with their own, but with one noticeable difference. The sun of this realm was not bright and yellow like the one they knew. This one was burnt orange, almost red in color. Its light looked as old as if the ancient star was on its way out. Christopher blinked as he stared up at it through the haze. "To what now?" he asked as he gazed out at the endless waves around them. "Head east. The island isn't far," Daniel instructed. Christopher plotted their course due east and continued on for an hour or so until the vague outline of land peeked through the thin layer of fog. Palais was dead ahead of them. Everyone on board did their best not to tense up as they got closer and closer to it. This was where everything would be decided. The fate of the world and all they knew would stand or fall depending on who was victorious. Though no one said it out loud, they agreed failure was not an option. When Christopher finally found a place to set anchor, they took a small boat the rest of the way there. The shores of Palais were as desolate as they were silent. The further they moved inland, the more they felt an oppressive sense of doom. The entire landmass was like walking into a room where someone had been murdered. They could feel the death, pain, and most of all fear. After all, it was written in the Book of Dark Names that in its heyday the sacred temple ran red with blood. Many had suffered on Pele, many more had died, and all of it done to quench the unquenchable bloodthirst of the Dark Ones. When they finally reached the crumbling ruins of the once formidable and grim city, they paused. The air was heavier here, almost as if it had to be forced to enter. Sean, Laura, and Daniel shivered involuntarily as the darkness creeped into their bones like damp cold. One did not have to be a psychic like them to feel the overpowering dread. Christopher and Richard's self-defenses were on high alert. Though it went against any and all survival modes, the unlikely band of heroes moved in to search for a Nephthys tomb. As they walked through the ruins, they came across various remains of temples that had been dedicated to one diabolical deity or another. The images of some of them were preserved in the crumbling stone. One likeness in particular stopped Christopher in his tracks. Throg the Juggernaut stared back at him with bulging toad-like eyes. His face was primarily a huge mouth filled with jagged teeth, ready to rip and tear apart any who crossed his path. In that moment the scientist was glad he had not seen the creature's face. "Come on, everybody, I found the tomb. It's over here," Daniel said, cutting into the dark memory of that day. The crew followed him through dilapidated dwellings and marketplaces until they stood in front of the high priest's death house. The crypt was built into the side of a small mountain with a circular door made from the thickest stone. The sacred symbols holding a Nephthys in place bore a striking resemblance to the religious talisman of the modern world. The crude etchings of a star, a fish, a crescent and a star, a lotus flower, and what looked like a core were all connected together on a great wheel. The great old ones were the current faces of religion, and the ones who had imprisoned a Nephthys. They had shared humanity, and had tried to save it from its need to self-destruct. Their first step was to banish the elder gods, and do away with any and all traces of their existence. Christopher's gaze moved from the doorway to an altar that was stationed just outside of it. Daniel was standing over it with a strange look on his face. A deep sadness that was born from dread covered him like a veil. "What is it, Dan? What's wrong?" Christopher asked, sensing it was more than just fear. "I'm losing faith," he said softly. "Faith in what?" Christopher asked, dumbfounded. "Faith in myself. Faith that I will have the strength to do what must be done." "You brought us this far, haven't you? You're not a quitter, Sims. You're a pain in the ass, but you aren't a quitter," Christopher joked. Daniel laughed in response. The rest of the group joined the two of them around the altar. Many lives had been taken in the name of Kadoth and his sister on this stony slab. Their main goal today was to make sure Anna did not become the next one. They all stood a moment more in silence before Daniel finally spoke. "So, we all understand what we have to do," he sighed as his gaze shifted from one person to another. Each of them quietly nodded. "I know it will be difficult, but we can't stray from the plan. If we have any hope of winning this at all, we have to stay strong." Everyone could tell by the tone in his voice he was saying this as much to himself as he was anyone else. Daniel was struggling with a terrible truth, one he had not shared. The battle had to be fought on their part with blind faith. They were fighting the dark, and they would have to do it with their eyes shut. They couldn't know what was coming around the corner, mainly because they wouldn't understand. Their viewpoint was still very human and very limited. He had the advantage of seeing the whole picture and understanding it. Even though he was losing more and more of the abilities he had taken from Hectonus, He had enough to see this through. There was a sound of distant thunder in the sky before it began to turn a deep purple. Another gate was opening, and this one wasn't from their realm. There was only one other being that would be looking to come through it. "Get ready, it's about to go down," Daniel said as Kaddoth emerged from the sky as a messiah of doom. The vile fiend drifted in among them with Anna in tow. When they touched down on the altar, she collapsed in exhaustion. Her body was covered in contusions and scratches. Daniel did his best to control his anger, but Kaddoth could feel his festering rage. A malicious smile covered his mouth as he drank it all in. The two of them shared a simmering glance as the maniacal being licked his lips. This was his spiteful way of letting Daniel know he knew just how to get under his skin. As his black eyes moved around the small circle, he fed from any and all negativity he could sponge off of them. When he had taken all he could, he shifted his gaze to a Nephesis crypt. The key to opening the final gate lay just beyond the sepulchre door. All he had to do now was eliminate the symbols from it and secure his sacrifice. He yanked Anna up by her hair, causing her to cry out in pain. Daniel's rage flared up again, allowing Kaddoth to feed once more. Christopher made note of the exchange and realized what the dark god was up to. He suspected that coming through the gate had weakened him. A resurrection was about to take place, and he was going to need all the power he could get. He grabbed Daniel and Sean's hands to form the circle. It was now or never. The rest of the group followed suit, forming a ring of flesh around the ancient darkness. Kaddoth simply laughed at them. "You think you can trap me?" he jeered. "I'm beyond such things. I am beyond you." With the swipe of one hand, he sent them all flinging through the air like rag dolls. Daniel, however, was able to make their landings a little softer by slowing them down. Kaddoth noticed the defense tactic and met it with sardonic applause. "Well done, counselor," he taunted. "But I wonder, can you counter this?" He opened his hand wide, aiming the palm towards them. An invisible force took hold of them. They felt as if they were all cocooned in a thick blanket that made them unable to move or barely breathe. Kaddoth grinned in sheer twisted bliss as he tightened his iron grip more to feed on their agony. He kept putting on pressure until at last he heard them groan. The sound was like sweet music to his ears. Daniel was fighting hard to keep his wits about him. He had to push past the pain. He had to try and focus. When Kaddoth had drank in all the agony he reasonably could get without killing his victims, he loosened his grip some. Why he didn't just kill them was anyone's guess, but Daniel knew. He watched in dread as the evil being picked up Anna's unconscious body and tied her to the altar. Kaddoth's face then altered into a more reptilian appearance. His eyes narrowed into red slits, while his jaw unhinged, allowing two large fangs to protrude out. He bit each of his wrists open, letting the blood drip thick and black onto the ground. A grotesque smile covered his inhuman mouth as he stared at his captive audience. In one leap, he left the altar and landed in front of a Nephesis crypt door. He smeared his blood over the sacred symbols, blotting them out. The ground began to shake as the massive stone door broke loose from its base and rolled away. The purple sky with its red sun turned black, chasing away what little light there was. The eternal night began to set in all around them as Kaddoth began to chant something over and over again in his ancient foul tongue. The same blood moon that had brought them to this place climbed the horizon as it had before. In its crimson beams, They watched in horror as Nephesis emerged from his tomb like a dark Lazarus. He was dressed like an Egyptian priest, complete with a shaved head. His pristine white robes were now mere rags hanging upon him like moss on a cypress tree. The high priest looked human enough, but it was his eyes that gave him away. They were the definition of soulless. There was no room for such things as love or compassion. His heart was a bottomless pit that could not be filled with anything but the darkness that remained. He paused in front of Kadoph and bowed down in submission. The foul god briefly acknowledged his worship before ordering him over to the altar. The high priest stared down at Anna's unconscious body with a wicked gleam in his eyes. Kadoph had chosen well. Khafra would be quite pleased with this form. He then raised his arms to the sky and began to chant in the long-lost language of the elder gods. The heavens responded with a low thunder that became louder and louder with every phrase spoken. The wind began to bluster and grew in strength. Nephesis slit Anna's wrist and let the blood flow down the sides of the altar. He then summoned his master to come over so that he might do the same to him. Kadoph's black blood mingled with Anna's, giving it a strange life. The substance began to move like a serpent as it encircled the base of the altar. Once it reconnected with itself, the blood lit up the sacrificial slab like a beacon. The sky directly above it also lit up. Another gate was about to open, one that held the dead. Richard, who'd been watching the whole scene with extreme apprehension, looked over at Daniel. The lawyer simply shook his head. They had to wait. Anna's body had to be vacated before they could act. The green circular light in the sky began to turn to and fro like a safe door. Nephesis was working its combination, and it was getting close. In one loud shriek, the high priest blew the gate open. The entrance took on a tunnel-like appearance, complete with a white light. As the gap between the two planes of existence narrowed, the sound of many voices poured from the sky. They resonated in the ears of all listening as a collective whisper from the souls too numerous to count. Strangely enough, they all knew just what it was they were hearing. They were listening to the voices of the dead. Every dearly departed person was speaking from the other side. Daniel's eyes moved down from the sky and back to his wife. Anna had regained consciousness. She met his gaze with uncertainty. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, so deep, in fact, that it made the ocean seem like a puddle by comparison. The longer he met her stare, the more pain he felt. He loved her more than anything. She was beautiful, beautiful to her soul, which is what he was gambling with. Should he fail, the inner light that shined from her eyes would be gone and replaced with eternal night. He would lose the woman he loved. His worst nightmare would come to pass. His mind began to slip as panic set in. Nephesis' raised voice and the thunderous sound of the gate opening momentarily moved his attention skyward. Khafra's soul was about to make its entrance. He had no time for fear or hesitation now. The final hour was at hand. He forced himself to refocus. He had to, for her sake. Daniel met her gaze one last time before reaching out to her with his mind. "I need you to close your eyes, baby. Please, close your eyes," he implored. Anna smiled, trying her best to hide her anxiety as she granted her husband's request and shut her eyes. Nephesis lowered his hands down from the air onto Anna's forehead. He shouted another phrase over and over again, causing her to cry out in pain. Her body arced in agony as her soul and flesh were torn from one another. Daniel watched his beloved writhe with all the torment of the damned. She'd had enough wits about her in the end to turn her face towards her husband. He had been her strength in life, and now she needed him to help her die. The unbearable pain became less as her soul began to make its exit. Daniel's despair could be measured in the tears that fell from his eyes as he watched the light slowly leave hers. He felt Kadaf feeding like a glutton on his misery, but he couldn't help it. She was gone, and it hurt. He continued only for a moment more to allow his adversary to eat. Fact was, it acted as a distraction from the urgency pouring in from his allies that surrounded him. They were anxious to fight back, but as he told them, timing was everything. Khafra and Anna had to pass one another in the tunnel first. It had to happen for it all to work out. He closed his eyes and focused his inner sight on the tunnel of death. He saw the bright light that so many described who had briefly walked this corridor, only to return from it. The peace and awe that was talked about rang true. He could feel it even though he was not truly present. The beautiful light at the end penetrated to his very core. The overwhelming goodness of love, harmony, joy, and wisdom pulled all who hungered for these things to it like a magnet. He spotted Anna walking towards it with a look of sheer bliss in her eyes. Even though he understood her longing to connect with it, he couldn't allow it. For a moment the light was blocked out, and the utopian feeling of eternal happiness flickered like a candle in the wind. A sense of danger, hedonistic vulgarity, and disregard for life itself disrupted any and all sense of hope and serenity. Khafra's black soul climbed from the dark pits of despair, momentarily blotting out the light and all its benevolence. She was a ferocious presence whose gaze was as hungry and fierce as her brother's. There was no humanity to speak of in her eyes, only wanton destruction. She was evil and dark and vile as those they had met within her blasted pantheon. Daniel shivered as he watched the half of the tunnel her abominable soul pass through go black. He waited in anticipation as she and Anna grew near. The closer they got, the faster his heart pounded. He was almost certain Kadaf could hear it, and was anxious that it might make him suspicious. "Keep it together, Sims," he told himself. "It's only just begun." As the two souls drew nearer to each other, Daniel reached out to his wife once more. "Please, Anna, don't go into the light," he begged. "I know it will be tempting. I know you'll have to fight hard to resist it, but you must. Wait for me. Wait for me to call you home. We still need you. I still need you." She paused and looked over her shoulder as if expecting to see him there. There was only the threshold, but she could feel her husband as surely as the light in front of her. She simply smiled, letting him know not only had she heard him, but that she would wait. She would always wait for him. "I love you," he declared just before Khafra's soul passed hers. The time was at hand. He pulled his consciousness back down to the abyss that was Palais to set the ball in motion. Daniel looked to the right of him where Richard was held fast by Kadaf's power. He silently nodded, giving him the go-ahead he had been waiting for. Though his ribs were being tightly squeezed in Kadaf's grip, he managed to get enough air in his lungs to begin an incantation. His voice was weak and barely audible, but it captured the Dark Lord and his impish priest's attention just the same. Kadaf's eyes glowed like crimson fire as he hissed in Richard's direction. The momentary distraction was enough to give Daniel the chance he needed to pry them all loose from the ancient god's power. The psychic blast generated from him acted like a bomb which knocked Kadaf to the ground. His hold over everyone instantly was removed. They wasted no time scattering out of his sight. Daniel, however, stayed right where he was. He had business with the dark god, and he was going to tend to it. Kadaf jumped to his feet with all the fury of hell in his eyes. They were still burning like red coals in his skull, but his face was no longer human. He had taken on his reptilian guise and was coming for Daniel with all he had. Common sense told the lawyer he should be afraid, but he wasn't. The evil son of a bitch had tortured his wife. Daniel's anger right now might be refueling the bastard, but he wasn't the only one getting strength from it. He was too pissed to run away and too determined to see an end to Gaddafi and all like him. Daniel Sims had been raging against the dying of the light his whole life. He had fought against the darkness in the courtrooms and never backed down. He wasn't about to now either. "Come on," he said through clenched teeth. "Come and get me." Gaddafi smashed him upside his head, sending him sailing through the air. His body crashed against the crypt wall, knocking the wind out of him. Daniel felt the iron grip of the Dark Lord's hand snatch him up by the neck, then start to squeeze. Gaddafi held him up off the ground, letting his feet dangle as he unhinged his jaw. Daniel saw the red fire in his throat and felt the sharp fangs against his chest. He was about to meet the same fate as all the others who had dared to worship the twisted deity. If this was how it was going to be, he was ready. Before the beast could sink his fangs in, he noticed Daniel was smiling. The fact that the human wasn't scared was ruining this meal for him. "Are you so anxious to be devoured?" Gaddafi asked in an inhuman voice. "Not at all. I just know something you don't," he replied weakly. "Oh, and what's that?" Gaddafi laughed. "Never underestimate your opponent," he declared. Before the dark god had time to reply, he felt a sharp pain in his back which carried through to his heart. He looked down to see the tip of a blade emerging through his chest. He spun around and saw Kaike standing behind him, covered in his black blood. Gaddafi clumsily swiped at his opponent but missed and fell to the ground. When he looked for his high priest for assistance, he didn't see him anywhere. Anna's body had been removed from the altar, and Richard was standing where Nephesis had been. But the human was reciting an incantation from the Book of Light. Gaddafi's eyes switched from confused to horrified as he realized what the mortals had done. The weapon protruding from his chest was none other than Belshazzar's blade. On Earth, it was the most notorious occult artifact in the world. The origins of the saber dated back to the 1930s in the backwoods of Kentucky. A small-time preacher by the name of Jebediah Powell was said to have been given the rapier from the archangel Michael. Powell claimed that the heavenly being instructed him to use the blade against those who had been measured and found wanting. The victims were chosen by the preacher sleeping with the sword at his side. The weapon would reveal the sinner and their sins in a dream. Many believed Jebediah to be insane until it was discovered how diabolical his victims were. The list included rapists, murderers, child molesters, and human traffickers, which this knowledge came to light. The laughter decreased. After it came out that the blade was made from an indestructible metal unknown on Earth, the humor died completely. The legendary weapon was stored away in the archives of the Vatican until Christopher used his family connections to get it out. The cardinal that had allowed its removal was one of the last people to speak to Jebediah before he died. He told him that one day a non-believer would come for the blade and to give it to him. When he asked the preacher why, he simply replied, it was the only thing that could slay the darkness. As Gaddafi lay on the ground, spewing blood from his mouth, there was no doubt Reverend Powell was touched, but not by insanity. Laura and Sean placed the dying god on the altar. Richard continued to recite the incantation that would send Gaddafi and his sister to the hell they deserved. Daniel watched in deep satisfaction as the black-hearted devils struggled in pain as Anna had. When his dark soul finally emerged, it hovered over them like a demon. A deep hiss escaped the hideous shadow before it was sucked up into the tunnel, then down to the pit where it belonged. Christopher, who was standing guard over the unconscious body of Anephasis, watched with everyone else as the tunnel shifted back from dark to light. They'd done it. They'd stopped them. All that was left to do now was put Anephasis back in his crypt and restore life to Anna. Their exhilaration was short-lived, however, as the island began to shift and then shake. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate and pull apart. "What's going on? Why is this happening?" Laura shouted. "The island's going to sink into the ocean. Kadof's death has brought this place to its end," Daniel said. "We've got to get back to the boat," Sean yelled. "Not until we deal with Anephasis. He has to be put back in his crypt. He has to go down with the island," Daniel yelled back. "Come on, let's get him back inside," Christopher said as he took hold of the ancient priest's arms. Laura and Akaike rushed over to help while Daniel picked up Anna's body from the ground. The three of them moved through the doorway, then down a narrow passage. As the sarcophagus came into view, they quickened their pace. When they were about to lift him up to put him back in, Anephasis came too. He began to struggle against them with a dreadful fate that they were about to force upon him. Though he was supposed to be a mere man, he seemed to have the strength of a devil, and he certainly fought like one. He managed to kick Laura and Sean off of him before grabbing Christopher by the wrist and twisting them to the point of pain. If Anephasis bent them 1 degree more, the scientist was sure they would break. As the island continued to sink, the crypt began to fall apart. Big chunks of stone toppled to the ground all around them. Laura picked up the largest one she could reasonably handle, then bashed the priest in the head with it until he stopped moving. She was covered in his blood. Christopher regarded her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "He didn't say he had to be awake or alive," she pointed out breathlessly. "Chris, you okay?" Sean asked. He nodded. "Let's move then," the detective ordered as they scrambled towards the entrance. Akaike led the way, followed by Laura and Christopher. They did their best to keep their balance as the ground quaked and the crypt fell apart around them. When the entrance finally came into view, they clambered towards it with all they had. Sean was the first to cross the threshold, then Laura, but as Christopher was about to come through, the entryway collapsed. Tons of rock and debris tumbled down into a massive pile blocking his exit. He was literally buried alive. Strangely enough, he could hear Richard's panicked voice calling from the other side. "Christopher? Christopher, can you hear me?" he shouted. "Yes, Rich, I can hear you," he shouted back. "We're going to try to get you out, okay?" Christopher said in a voice of complete desperation. "There's no time, Rich. You know that as well as I do. All of you need to get out of here now," he ordered. "We're not leaving you to die," Laura yelled in despair. "If you don't, then we all die. Don't be stupid. Get out of here now," he roared. "Not without you," Akaike grunted stubbornly as he tried pulling rocks away. "This is how it's supposed to be. Tell them, Sims. Tell them what you told me," Christopher said. Daniel looked into their desperate faces and smiled grimly. "We have to leave, guys. We can't help him. Not now." "Danny, we have got to go," Daniel said wretchedly. "We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do, but you don't want to risk making it. I know you love Anna. I do too. But I'm not prepared to leave him here to drown," Laura screamed. Daniel's eyes flashed in misery as he met her accusing gaze. "Sometimes sacrifices aren't just made to the dark. Sometimes you have to make them to keep the light from going out," he said, before turning away to head for the boat. "What the hell does that mean?" she cried. "It means you have to trust him. It means you have to go. Get out of here, all of you. Go now," Christopher yelled. "Chris, go on, Laura. Leave. We know that the universe is filled with doors. Death is just one of them. I'll walk right through it and go back to Evelyn." Laura's eyes filled with tears as the harsh reality finally took hold. They couldn't save him. Despite this terrible truth, he had enabled them to walk away by reminding them of a better one. He could finally be with Evelyn, As the ancient temples began to fall like dominoes, they ran as fast as they could back to the boat. Christopher closed his eyes as water began to seep up into the crypt. Though he knew what ultimate fate awaited him, he couldn't help but be afraid. Death wasn't the end, but suffering it. That was the bad part. He tried calming himself by focusing his mind on Evelyn's soft blue eyes. As the water level increased around him, he heard her voice. "Be brave," she murmured. "It will all be over soon." This was the last thing he heard before the water overtook him and his struggle for breath began. All reason left as his lungs filled with fluid and the panic set in. Drowning was terrifying. 4 minutes never seemed so long. As he drifted through the darkness of the crypt, he saw various artifacts from the lost civilization float by, images of the ancient gods and relics that were used to honor them swirled about like bleak reminders as to why he was here. A Nephesis bludgeoned body carried up from his sarcophagus before slipping by him. Darkness mercifully began to close in as his consciousness slipped away. In the next moment, he saw a door, not one that he had to open, but a passageway. Light, like no other that he had ever seen, was emanating from it. His first thought was to get near it, and no sooner had he desired it, he was there. A picture began to emerge as he stood in the purity of the glow. He saw the gravel path that led up to the lake house, her lake house. He heard a dog barking. Sarah was barking. Then he heard her laugh as she playfully threw the Labrador's ball. He had reached the door, and all he had to do was walk through it. When he tried, however, he couldn't. He could not get past the threshold, nor take a single step towards it. Why? Why couldn't he? His mind began to spin out of control as thoughts of hell took hold. What if the religious types were right? What if hell did await people like him? What if this was it? He would suffer the trappings of Tantalus himself. He would see and hear his heaven, but never be able to go in. Evelyn's sweet laughter filled his ears again. The small comfort was enough to make him focus, make him think. Then it occurred to him, perhaps she had to invite him in. After all, this was her heaven. She was his. He began to call her name to try and get her attention. Evelyn, who was standing on the shores of the lake, ceased her horseplay with Sarah. Had someone called her name? She swore she heard them. She looked down at her canine companion, who was frozen now, with her head cocked in curiosity. Sarah had heard it too. Evelyn turned around to see who it was. What she saw, however, was not a person, but light, a strange glow of light, like that which filters in from an open door. She heard her name being called again and realized the voice was coming from there. Cautiously, she walked up the hill towards it. The closer she got, the clearer the sound, until at last she recognized the one who was calling. Tears streamed down her cheeks as her walk became a run. When she stepped into the light, she saw him. Christopher stared back at her with all the love a man could have for a woman. The tainted decay that had attached itself to such an emotion was left behind in the world before. All that remained was the wonderful unlimited beauty that the poets had written about. Though he was surrounded by light, his image was somewhat blurred. He looked as if he were floating in water. She saw him raise his hand up, then reach towards her. For a moment, she wondered if this was just an illusion. Had his time truly come? Did he really wish to share her heaven? Then she remembered what he had said before he left the last time. "I will miss you until my dying day." For him to be here now, reaching out to her, could only mean one thing. His time had indeed come. Evelyn smiled as tears of joy streamed down her face. It was believed on earth that no one cries in heaven, but that was just one of many misconceptions. Christopher was coming home to her at last. Her hand trembled with excitement as she reached into the thin barrier of light to pull him through. She noticed the closer their fingers got, the clearer his image became. When their palms almost met, Evelyn felt someone pull her away. Rachel's soft arms wrapped around her daughter as she held on to her tightly. "What are you doing?" Evelyn cried. "It's not time yet, sweetie. You have to let him go back," she whispered. "But why? I don't understand," Evelyn exclaimed. "Don't worry, Evie. One day he'll return and be with you, just not today. Let him go." Evelyn watched in despair as his image went blurry once more before fading out completely. The passageway to Evelyn's world shut as Christopher was dragged along a darkened corridor by someone. Whoever it was had latched onto him right before he and Evelyn had managed to touch. They had jerked him away and were taking him to God knows where. Strangely enough, he wasn't afraid. Somehow he knew that whoever this captor was, they didn't mean him any harm. As he drifted behind them like a boat being towed, he literally saw pieces of his life flash before his eyes. His earliest memory was of his sister chasing him through their garden. He saw Kaylee, not as a woman, but a mere girl, laughing and joking as she scooped her little brother up in her arms. For a moment, his heart ached as the man and boy merged into bitter sweetness for the one they lost. The next image was when he was 10 and being beaten by 2 bullies from school. He felt the pain of their pounding fist and could taste the blood in his mouth. In another flash, he saw his wedding day, then his daughter being born. The final scene he saw was a hospital room with medical staff all around him. He heard Spanish being spoken, but before everything went black, he saw Evelyn standing just outside of the doctor's circle. She was staring at him with mournful blue eyes. The sadness was not the same sort she carried in life. It was different. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, what was happening, but he couldn't speak, couldn't move either. She smiled sadly at his confusion before blowing him a kiss and disappearing completely. The sound of the heart monitor flatlining was the last thing he heard as the darkness set in. "Dr. Harris? Christopher Harris, can you hear me?" a voice called. Christopher's eyes fluttered open and quickly closed again as the bright light assaulted them. "Dr. Harris, can you hear me?" the voice asked again. "Yes, I can," he answered weakly. "Can you open your eyes?" This time he could discern the voice had a thick Spanish accent. "Can you please draw the blinds? The light, it's too much," he replied. The doctor ordered the curtains drawn. As soon as he heard them being pulled close, he tried opening his eyes again. This time it was easier. His doctor's face was the first thing he saw. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper-colored hair. He was wearing silver metal-framed glasses along with a look of concern. "How are you feeling? Do you remember anything?" he asked. "Not much," Christopher lied. "Your friends who brought you in said you were knocked overboard. Do you recall any of that?" the doctor asked, still trying to discern what happened. "Some of it. I'm not real sure about a lot. I'm still rather groggy. Are my friends here?" he asked, knowing they were. "Yes," the doctor nodded. "May I see them?" "Of course, if you're up to it," he replied. "Thank you," Christopher smiled weakly. Daniel and Anna were the first to enter the room. She was dressed in a hospital gown, and he was pushing her in a wheelchair. After everyone else filed in from the hallway, the conversation went from obscure to astounding honesty. "How the hell did I get out of that crypt? The island sank, didn't it? You all jumped dimensions. How is any of this possible?" he asked in a voice that was not only amazed but a little disappointed as well. When we got back to the boat, Sean used the defibrillator to restart Anna's heart. We had to bring her back from the other side. Once we did, she was able to transcend into where you were and claim your body and your soul, Daniel explained. "So it was you who grabbed me and dragged me along," Christopher murmured. "Yes, and I'm sorry," she replied, feeling his sense of despondency. He simply smiled at her. "How are you feeling? Pretty rough, I would imagine," Richard joked. "Shit would be more accurate," Christopher replied with a weary grin. "So did you see her? Did you see Evelyn again?" Laura asked, her clear blue eyes filled with hope. "Briefly," he told her. "Did she say anything?" "No, not in words anyway, but I know she's waiting for me," he said, bringing a somber silence to the group. Christopher's eyes trailed over to Daniel. He had told him he would have to make an ultimate sacrifice, and that as a man in love, he would understand his choice. Up until this moment, he didn't get Daniel's meaning. He did now. "The sacrifice that I was supposed to make, it wasn't my life. It was my death, wasn't it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," Daniel nodded, "and I know how hard it was for you to give up eternity with her." For life to continue, a resurrection had to happen, both male and female, to restore the balance and replace the two dark souls we sent on, Anna explained. "Well, now that this chapter is closed, where do we all go from here?" Laura wondered aloud. "Back to our lives, I suppose," Sean said, "until the next big adventure." "You think there will be another one?" she grinned. "There's always another one," he assured her. "Okay, but until that happens, what do you say we head for the cafeteria? I'm so hungry even hospital food sounds good to me," Richard suggested. "Lead the way," Daniel said. After telling Christopher to get some rest, they all filed out, leaving him alone. A nurse, along with an orderly, came in directly after. "Time for a quick checkup," she said. He nodded and held his arm out for her to put the blood pressure cuff on his arm. They would be keeping close watch on him for a while. While the nurse listened to his heart, the orderly took his pulse. He felt a slight jolt, like a small shock, when each of them touched him. Suddenly, an image of the two of them in a supply closet having sex popped into his head. He could hear their heavy breathing, their kissing, and even feel their carnal energy. He knew they were both married, and that this had been ongoing between them for about 3 months. When they both let go of him, the vision faded along with any other information about them. As they recorded his stats, he stared at them in total dismay. What had just happened? "Dr. Harris, are you all right?" the nurse asked with arched brows of concern. "Yes, I'm fine," he stammered. They both smiled pleasantly at him before leaving. As the orderly turned to go, he noticed a reddish-pink smear on his neck. The nurse came back in to tell him a detail about his care she had forgotten to mention, and as she did so, Christopher noticed the shade of her lipstick. He also noticed it was slightly smudged. Never being one to back away from the truth, he decided to test his theory. Supply closets aren't the safest places to make out, especially when it's imperative you be discreet. You two might want to look for another hiding place, if you wish to stay married. The look of utter shock and embarrassment on their faces said it all. They left quickly, without another word, leaving only their guilt in their wake. He lay back against his pillows and chuckled in irony. How do you make a skeptic into a believer? You turn him into the very thing he denies. He could hardly wait to tell the others.